This is a brief introductory lecture on the life and work of Enrique Dussel. We'll be studying his book, Philosophy of Liberation. But before that, just a little background about his life and his work. Uh, Enrique Dussel was born Enrique Domingo Dussel Ambrosini on Christmas Eve, 1934, in La Paz, near Mendoza in Argentina. He was involved with a group called Catholic Action at one point in his life. It was an effort to bring Catholic ideals into the workplace and even into politics. He was president of the Student Federation at the University of Mendoza. He got his philosophy degree with a thesis on the idea of the common good from the pre Socratics to Aristotle. It's very interesting. That was awarded in 1957. He got his doctorate in philosophy at Complutense University in Madrid in 1959. He wrote a 1,200-page thesis entitled The Concept of the Common Good, and Charles de Connick and Jacques Maritain. De Connick and Maritain were very important 20th century Thomist philosophers primarily influenced by the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. Dussel became a member of what's called the Madrid School, which is centered around the work of Ortega y Gasset, who we've talked about, and that school also included Zubiri. According to Eduardo Mendieta, Dussel discovered Latin America from Europe. And you're going to hear in Dussel's work the importance, as we've been stressing with Akri as well, the importance of place. And for Dussel, the main structure of place is the center versus the periphery. The center versus the periphery. And what Mendieta is saying about Dussel, which Dussel says himself, is that he really only got to see what it meant to be a Latin American once he got into a place that thought of itself and actually was functionally and in terms of influence and power, the center. And from that center, from Europe, he could look back on uh, his place in Latin America and see that it was operating at a periphery of that center. And that's going to be a very important concept that runs through his work, this idea of center and periphery. From 1959 to 1961, he lived on a kibbutz, kind of a commune in Israel. He studied the Semitic roots of Christianity, he learned Hebrew, and explored the spiritual roots of poverty, another important key theme in Dussel's work. He got his licentiate in theology from the Catholic Institute in Paris in 1965. You may recall that Zubiri also spent time at the Catholic Institute. He got a doctorate in history at the Sorbonne in Paris. His thesis was entitled The Spanish American Bishops, Defenders and Evangelizers of the Indians, and that was accepted in 1967. He returned to Argentina in 1967. He taught philosophical anthropology and ethics at the National University of Cuyo. He discovered there the thought of Emmanuel Levinas, who we've mentioned in an earlier talk. He said that Levinas, quote, woke him up from ontological sleep, woke him up from ontological sleep. Now, that is a nod to something that Immanuel Kant once said about David Hume. David Hume is the empiricist philosopher who developed the idea that we can't know anything except that which comes through the senses. And Kant had been a kind of a metaphysical thinker in his training, and he read David Hume, this Scottish Enlightenment figure, and he said he awakened me from my dogmatic slumber. What did he mean by that? Kant meant he had been in effect sleepwalking through life, through his philosophical life, assuming things that he really didn't know to be true, talking about things that maybe he had no right or justification to be talking about, saying things that sounded like meant something, but maybe they did not. So reading Hume was like a bucket of cold water thrown on him, made him wake up and think about philosophy differently. And Kant certainly did that with his what he referred to as his Copernican revolution in philosophy. He turned everything inside out, just like Copernicus turned inside out the idea of astronomy. Before Copernicus, the idea was that the Earth was the center of everything and immobile, and everything was going around it. And Copernicus says, no, no, and we have a solar system. The sun is in the center of that system, and the Earth is rotating on its axis and revolving around the sun. And what we thought was the case, that we were standing still and everything was moving around us, was an optical illusion. We just weren't seeing things properly. So Kant thought philosophically Hume had awakened him, and Kant affected his own revolution in philosophy. He turned to what he calls the transcendental subject, the idea that human reason is not just a passive recipient of reality, but a former or shaper of reality. Dussel's saying the same thing when he reads Emmanuel Levinas. Something in the work of Levinas, and we'll explore this in more detail later, woke Dussel up to something, got him to see something. He had been doing a kind of philosophy called ontology, the study of being. But Dussel thought, after reading Levinas, that he was kind of sleepwalking through that work. He wasn't seeing things properly. It was effectively a kind of an intellectual or optical illusion about how he was seeing things. So Levinas is a very important philosopher, a Jewish French thinker, very, very important thinker in his own right. So we'll talk a little bit more about him as well. In 1973, a military group bombed the Dussel home. He was caught up in the Juan Perón, the Peronist upheaval in 1975, and he was expelled from the university, and he and his family went into exile. And he's been a professor of political philosophy at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma in Mexico, the UNAM, since 1976, and he's still there, and he's still giving talks. You could find him on Facebook where they announce the different seminars and so forth that they're constantly working on. So Dussel is still very much going strong. Now, the book that we're going to read together, at least a good portion of it, was published in 1975, Philosophy and Liberation. And it's basically an attempt to give an overview and kind of a high-level summary of a great deal of work. Dussel is a very prolific writer. He wrote a 5-volume work on ethics. He wrote books about Hegel and Levinas and Marx and a number of historical studies. And Philosophy of Liberation in 75 was his attempt to try to pull a lot of that together for us to see what the big picture looks like. It shows the influences of his mature thought, Marx, very importantly. Interestingly, the medieval mystical approaches to God for Christians. The philosopher Schelling, who's a 19th century philosopher, a critic of Hegel, who was so influential on Marx. The Jewish thinkers, Franz Rosenzweig, who wrote an important book called The Star of Redemption. Martin Buber, who wrote, of course, many works as well, but his most important work, often read in studies of existentialism, called I and Thou, Buber's work, I and Thou. Rosenzweig and Buber also translated the Hebrew Bible into German. I think it may be still the most read German translation of that. And of course, Emmanuel Levinas. So even though Dussel is a Catholic, from a Catholic background, very influenced by Jewish thinkers as well. The book, Philosophy and Liberation, was written in exile. He says, as you'll read, that he was without his personal library. He was on the run. He was outside of his normal place, or the normal place, trying to write, he says, from memory. He says this is maybe a kind of apology, but also, as we'll see, an indication of the importance of doing work while not in the center, not in the standard place. And I think that we've talked about that in the past when we've talked about Zubiri not teaching at the university for most of his career, but teaching his cursos from his apartment, out of place. And Ea Korea, a Spaniard, a Basque from the center, spending most of his life in Latin America and El Salvador, and talking about that which has gotten left out of Catholic theology, the poor majority. Well, here's another kind of exile. Now, I want to start with something that It's important to recognize from the beginning, these are the words of Eduardo Mendieta, an important thinker in his own right, a student of Dussel's work. He wrote an introduction to Enrique Dussel's book, The Underside of Modernity. And this is what Mendieta wrote. In contrast to the dialectic of a cosmos, being, or consciousness that ascends to unity, autonomy, divine passivity, or self determination, so as to return to itself, where the other of itself is left out as a residue of the true process, the dialectic, as the non being, the particular, the unknown, and worthless. The warm current of dialogic, apophantic, creative, analogical thinking moves from the otherness of the other, which always remains beyond the totalized totality, the moment of transformation, of creative eruption into the frozen and stabilized totality, arrives from beyond the horizon of this totality. This is the metaphysical exteriority of the other. Now, that raises the question, huh? Like, what did all that mean? That's pretty dense. There's a lot in there. What was he talking about? So, what he's trying to set up here, and it's something that's going to go throughout his work in philosophy of liberation, is a contrast. He's going to contrast two ways of looking at things. He's going to contrast what can go under the umbrella label of the dialectic, something that we've talked about, and what he calls the dialogic or the analogic or the apophantic or the creative. We'll have to explain all this as we go along. So you got the dialectic over here, and then you've got the dialogic or the analogic or the apophantic or the creative over here. It's going to distinguish those two. Dialectic, and that's coming from the philosopher Hegel and coming through Marx, is an idea where everything is working itself out towards a final unity. Except, Dussel's going to say, that necessarily excludes whatever doesn't fit and calls that, the stuff that doesn't fit, non being, doesn't count, the may on, the nothings. So the dialectical process, you could definitely see this in Marx, where in a materialistic way that all of history is working itself out to this unity of the communistic society. And that's fine, except for the fact that when you draw a circle around something and say, this is the unity, this is the one, every time you draw that circle, there's an inside and an outside. And the dialectic focuses on what's on the inside, on the unity, on the autonomy. Hegel does that in terms of absolute ideas or absolute spirit. Marx does it materialistically or concretely in terms of the material mode of production, distribution, as we've talked about. But it's a kind of overbearing, overwhelming drive to unification, to pull it all together. What Dussel calls the dialogic, the analogic, the apophantic, creative, he uses these terms kind of interchangeably. He says that starts from what he calls a metaphysical exteriority of the other. The other's been on the outside, on the exterior. In other words, it starts from what's excluded from that dialectic, from that drive to have a one view where we all just have it all figured out and we're all allegedly getting along, so long as those who don't get along don't count. Right? So that which doesn't fit neatly in the current system and can question and disrupt that system becomes the starting point for Dussel's work. That's the starting point. So you'll see in the slides that I provide for you, I've color coded these passages, these distinctions. So the color blue, anything I color blue in the slides, you can mnemonically remember, blue is bad, bad for Dussel anyway. It's something that Dussel is criticizing. And anything that's color coded with the red is right. Red, right on. RR. Red is right on. So I hope, when you look at the slides anyway, you'll be able to more easily pick out what's he arguing for. It's all the red stuff. What's he arguing against? It's all the blue stuff. Now, just finish up this quick introduction, I just want to raise just a standard philosophical question and see where Dussel comes down on this, because it's going to color all the rest of his work. What is first philosophy? What is first philosophy? The term first philosophy, prima philosophia, is found in Aristotle's work called the Metaphysics. The work called the Metaphysics doesn't have the word metaphysics in it. If you say, "What's that book about?" you would say, "Well, it's about metaphysics." But that was not a term in use at the time that those writings of Aristotle were pulled together. What is that book about? Well, it's a big book. There's a lot going on in it. But one of the things Aristotle's talking about is theology. That's a word we think we understand. But what Aristotle means by theology is not what we mean in the religious sense of theology. Not theologico, not theologal, neither one of those Zuberian terms. Theology is about the theos, and the theos for Aristotle was something like the first cause, the primary cause, the uncaused causer, the unmoved mover, at the source of all that is. So if you want to study what is, you get back to the source of all that is. He didn't mean that in any kind of a spiritual kind of way, but more almost like you and I might say is a scientific kind of way. The other thing, the other phrase that's mentioned in there, and Aristotle says, what he's working on is first philosophy. And he doesn't mean the first philosophy that you study when you're in school, or the first thing that occurs to you. In fact, he might say that the first philosophy is maybe one of the last things you get to. When you're trying to understand everything, you're kind of working down to the base. You're getting back to the arche. You're doing like an archaeology. You're digging back to the principles, to the first things, the arche. And for Aristotle, what he was working on that book was trying to get to the philosophy of the first things, of the basic things, of the fundamental things, of what it takes for being to be. That's what he was working on. So for Aristotle, he would say, if he had the word, that metaphysics is first philosophy, the study of being qua being. That name metaphysics was actually put on Aristotle's book in effect by a librarian, if you want to put it that way. The librarian is putting all of Aristotle's books in order, and Aristotle wrote about everything under the sun. Really, he wrote several books on logic, several books on ethics, how to give a good speech, how to write a good play, a biology book, a book on the weather, meteorology, and he wrote the first physics books that we have. The study of and trying to understand things in terms of their causes. And Aristotle took that path as far as it could go, understanding things in terms of its causes, till you get to a first cause. But a first uncaused causer doesn't have a cause, so you can't think about it in terms of physics, because physics understand things in terms of their causes. And if an uncaused cause it exists or is, then you need some other way of talking about it. So he writes this other book on first philosophy. And the librarian said, where am I going to catalog this book? He says, well, I'm going to put it right after the physics book. Well, in Greek, ta biblia metaphysica, the book after the physics book is, metaphysics, metaphysics. But we now use that word to signify the study of being. What is there really? That's the question. When we make the modern turn, as we saw, is with Descartes especially, his first question, even though he's writing a book, Meditations on First Philosophy, he wasn't doing metaphysics. His primary question was not what is there really. His primary question is, what can I know for sure? What can I know with certainty? And when you're asking about what can I know and what can I know to be true, you're doing not metaphysics anymore, but you're doing epistemology. So the modern philosophical problematic begins with this question of what can I know and how do I know things? Liberation philosophy is going to take ethics as first philosophy. How is it best for us to be? Let's start with that and see what that tells us about what we can know and how we come to know, and what that can tell us about what there is. In terms of metaphysics and ontology. It's an inspiration that comes from Marx. It's an inspiration that comes primarily from Emmanuel Levinas. So you have to remember that. What's the starting point of the philosopher? Are they trying to figure out what is there really? Are they trying to figure out what can I know, or what can we know for sure? And how do we know? What counts as truth? Or is their first question, the thing that drives everything, that makes their thought go? Is it ethics? Is it the question of how is it best for me to be? How is it best for us to be? Well, with Dussel, that's it. Ethics is first philosophy. Now, keep that in mind, and we'll pick up the beginning of philosophy and liberation next time.